The Evil Eye, Part 3. Some years ago, a woman living in Kerry declared that she was overlooked by the evil eye. She had no pleasure in her life and no comfort, and she wasted away because of the fear that was on her, caused by the following singular circumstance. Every time that she happened to leave home alone, and that no one was within call, she was met by a woman totally unknown to her, who, fixing her eyes on her in silence with a terrible expression, cast her to the ground and proceeded to beat and pinch her till she was nearly senseless, after which her tormentor disappeared. Having experienced this treatment several times, the poor woman finally abstained altogether from leaving the house, unless protected by a servant or companion, and this precaution she observed for several years, during which time she never was molested. So at last she began to believe that the spell was broken, and that her strange enemy had departed forever. In consequence, she grew less careful about the usual precaution, and one day stepped down alone to a little stream that ran by the house to wash some clothes. Stooping down over her work, she never thought of any danger, and began to sing as she used to do in the light-hearted days before the spell was on her, when suddenly a dark shadow fell across the water, and looking up, she beheld to her horror the strange woman on the opposite side of the little stream, with her terrible eyes intently fixed on her, as hard and as still as if she were of stone. Springing up with a scream of terror, she flung down her work and ran towards the house, but soon she heard footsteps behind her, and in an instant she was seized, thrown down to the ground, and her tormentor began to beat her even worse than before, till she lost all consciousness, and in this state she was found by her husband lying on her face and speechless. She was at once carried to the house, and all the care that affection and rural skill could bestow were lavished on her, but in vain. She, however, regained sufficient consciousness to tell them of the terrible encounter she had gone through, but died before the night had passed away. It was believed that the power of fascination by the glance, which is not necessarily an evil power like the evil eye, was possessed in a remarkable degree by learned and wise people, especially poets, so that they could make themselves loved and followed by any girl they liked simply by the influence of the glance. About the year 1790, a young man resided in the country Limerick who had this power in a singular and unusual degree. He was a clever, witty rhymer in the Irish language, and probably had the deep poet eyes that characterize warm and passionate poet natures, eyes that even without necromancy have been known to exercise a powerful magnetic influence over female minds. One day, while traveling far from home, he came upon a bright, pleasant-looking farmhouse, and feeling weary, he stopped and requested a drink of milk and leave to rest. The farmer's daughter, a young, handsome girl, not liking to admit a stranger, as all the maids were churning and she was alone in the house, refused him admittance. The young poet fixed his eyes earnestly on her for some time in silence, then slowly turning round left the house, and walked towards a small grove of trees just opposite. There he stood for a few moments, resting against the tree, and facing the house as if to take one last vengeful or admiring glance, then went his way without once turning round. The young girl had been watching him from the windows, and the moment he moved, she passed out of the door like one in a dream, and followed him slowly, step by step, down the avenue. The maids grew alarmed, and called to her father, who ran out and shouted loudly for her to stop, but she never turned or seemed to heed. The young man, however, looked round, and seeing the whole family in pursuit, quickened his pace, first glancing fixedly at the girl for a moment. Immediately she sprang towards him, and they were both almost out of sight, when one of the maids espied a piece of paper tied to a branch of the tree where the poet had rested. From curiosity, she took it down, and the moment the knot was untied, the farmer's daughter suddenly stopped, became quite still, and when her father came up, she allowed him to lead her back to the house without resistance. When questioned, She said that she felt herself drawn by an invisible force to follow the young stranger wherever he might lead, and that she would have followed him through the world, for her life seemed to be bound up in his. She had no will to resist, and was conscious of nothing else but his presence. Suddenly, however, the spell was broken, and then she heard her father's voice, and knew how strangely she had acted. At the same time, the power of the young man over her vanished, and the impulse to follow him was no longer in her heart. The paper, on being opened, was found to contain 5 mysterious words written in blood, and in this order: Sator, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas. These letters are so arranged that read in any way, right to left, left to right, up or down, the same words are produced, and when written in blood with a pen made of an eagle's feather, they form a charm which no woman, it is said, can resist. But the incredulous reader can easily test the truth of this assertion for himself. These popular stories are provokingly incomplete, and one cannot help regretting that the romance of The Poet and the Farmer's Daughter was not brought to a happy termination. But the Irish tales are in general rather incoherent, more like remembered fragments of ancient stories than a complete, well-organized dramatic composition with lights well placed in a striking catastrophe. The opening is usually attractive with the exciting formula, once upon a time, from which one always expects so much. And there is sure to be an old woman, weird and witch-like, capable of the most demoniacal actions, and a mysterious man who promises to be the unredeemed evil spirit of the tale. But in the end, they both turn out childishly harmless, and their evil actions seldom go beyond stealing the neighbor's butter or abducting a pretty girl, which sins mere mortals would be quite equal to, even without the aid of the gods of the earth, and their renowned leader, the Finvara, the king of the fairies. The following tale, however, of a case of abduction by fairy power is well constructed. The hero of the narrative has our sympathy and interest, and it ends happily, which is considered a great merit by the Irish, as they dislike a tale to which they cannot append, as an epilogue, the hearty and outspoken "Thank God."